It's almost embarrassing to admit in the Bible, but guess whose ancestry traces to Moab? King David. Ruth is a Moabitess. The royal dynasty can be traced to a Moabitess. No descendant of Moab can be even in the congregation. And now you've got the most celebrated king. Granny is from Moab. Nonetheless, the sweet psalmist of Israel, Neil, David, is Moabite in his descent. He builds a shrine to what the biblical writers call the abomination of the Moabites. In Jerusalem, builds a temple to Chemosh. So he's building a temple to Jehovah. Good job, Solomon. Nice. Thank you very much. And he's like, wait till you see the place I built for Chemosh, the god of the Moabites.
Golden satyrs on these vines, centaurs, the horse legs guys. Solomon was old. His wives had turned his hearts to strange gods. By adoring Astarte, which is Venus, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, Solomon had built a high place to Chemosh, the idol of Moab.
Omri, have Ahab. Remember, Ahab is the one that's married to Jezebel, who's gone down historically as the rottenest woman of all. In August of 1868, a Prussian minister, a missionary, Prussian, right? Frederick Augustus Klein is told by Zatam, hey, I've got something I want to show you. It's a treasure. It's the wonder of the region, Neil. No Frank has ever laid eyes on this. And Klein says, what is it?
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today my guest is Ross K. Nichols, who has a YouTube channel that you need to go subscribe to right now. The link's in the description. I'm showing it on the screen. Pause the video. This video ain't going nowhere. Go hit that subscribe button. Hit that bell as well. And on top of that, he also has a website called rossknichols.com. And here's where you can find his greatest work of all, the Moses Scroll. This is one of my favorite books. We talked about this in an earlier video, and it's a really interesting discovery that he has written about in his book. So go and check out those links in the description. But today is going to be another discovery story that we're going to discuss, and it has to do with Moab, the place that's mentioned in the Bible. And as far as I know, this city is ancient. This goes back to the Bronze Age. You have inscriptions in Egypt by Ramses II mentioning Moab. And it looks like this is the same place. I mean, where else? Who else would it be? It's the same region of the world, and it's the same territory. So we're talking about an ancient city. And here's my guest right now. Welcome. How's it going?
Neil, look, man, I am so excited to be on your show today. Every time I hear from you, it's only someone like you that would write me some bizarre late night message that says, hey, Ross, why aren't people talking about, and then you throw some ancient god across. I mean,
Sabbatios.
You sent me that the other day. Well, let me tell you something. I'm going to throw one back at your audience today, Neil. Today, I get to return that favor, and we're going to talk about a little bit about the god Chemosh. Now, I know you know this god. This god is particular to a region you mentioned as you brought me in. I could hear you from the back of the studio. You're talking about the land of Moab. The land of Moab. When you and I went to Israel, I so wish that we wouldn't have had to split ways, because you went to Egypt and I went to the ancient land of Ammon and Moab. I went to Jordan.
Yeah.
And I was watching on Facebook, you're showing your audience stuff like you're in Egypt. And I was thinking, man, I wish I was with him, but I really wish you would have been with me, because let me tell you, man, I was hiking in caves. looking for treasure, all kind of
Saw the
fun.
videos. Trust me, I was like, I wish I went there too.
Hey, you know what we need to do? We need to bring your audience and my audience and go together. I'm going in this fall. I'm going to Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, following the route of the literary route, let's say, because some people might not believe it ever happened. But at least according to the biblical literature, the children of Israel left Egypt, went through the desert, went into the ancient land of Moab, and then crossed over into the land of Canaan. So I want to tell you, and you jump in anytime, man. But what I really want to talk about is probably I would say arguably the single greatest biblically oriented piece of archaeology ever. Like like you could say, well, what about this? What about okay? So there are some you might debate. But I'm telling you, in my opinion, that what we're going to talk about today is the single greatest archaeological discovery related to a biblical text. We're going to talk about the Moabite Stone, Neil, also known as the Mesha Stele. And that's where I want to kind of pick up the story. I know your viewers are more knowledgeable than most, but just kind of, if you don't mind, man, I'll just kind of hit a couple of high points, like
Yeah.
from the biblical text, kind of to orient people. Like I lead tours, as you know, and a lot of people really want to go to Israel. I do too. I love it. But they never cross over the Jordan into Transjordan, where so much of the biblical narrative takes
That's the
place.
Sinai Desert. That's where it's at. That's the
Well,
original, you know?
if you go to that desert region, as you mentioned, in the Sinai or in the Transjordan region by Ammon and Moab, east of the Rift, let's say, man, you're in Bible territory. Let me hit a couple of high points.
Yes.
Of course, you know that Balak, remember Balak in the book of Numbers, Balak hires Bilam, the guy from Talking Donkey fame. Numbers chapter 22 through 24. He hires Balak. Balak hires Bilam to come in and curse his enemies, Israel. So you got that piece, but you also have right after that in Numbers chapter 25, Israel succumbs to the enticement of these Moabite gods, and the women of Midian and Moab entice the children of Israel to go after their other gods and make offerings to their gods and so forth. But you also remember the positive aspects of this land. This is the final place. In other words, Moses, the great lawgiver of the Pentateuch, never even crosses into the land of promise. He dies in the land of Moab. He's buried in the land of Moab. So this is very, very central to the biblical story in the Pentateuch. So Moses is buried there. And then you have Gad and Reuben and half tribe of Manasseh settle in that area east of the Jordan Rift in Transjordan. Now, this land and its people really becomes the arch enemy of Israel throughout much of the biblical period. All of this, by the way, leads up to the story of the greatest discovery. So you have the biblical writers, Neil, are at a pain to really show that Moab is just not worth anything. They're the enemy. So the story in Genesis 19, it's like it's rumors on the street. Hey, tell me about the ancestry of Moab. And Genesis 19 tells this really bad story about how Lot, remember Lot, the nephew of Abraham, his daughters at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah get the old man drunk, and they both sleep with their dad. And through those unions, we have the birth, according to the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 19, of Ammon and Moab. So it really starts off on the wrong foot. You know, those are some really bad things to say about your neighbor. Whether it really happened that way or whether the writers are so much trying to put out bad press on their neighbors, nonetheless, that's the way the biblical story records the beginnings of the people of Moab and Ammon. And then if we move forward in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 4, the writer of Deuteronomy, most often attributed to Moses, but the writer of Deuteronomy makes it very clear that no descendant of Moab will be allowed into the generation or into the tent, if you will, into the congregation of the children of Israel. And the reason this is, according to the writer of Deuteronomy, is they didn't greet you well when you came out of Egypt. They didn't offer you bread, etc. Plus, the horrible accounts mentioned in Numbers. They entice them to false worship and that kind of thing. So they become the arch enemy. Remember now, if you're born from this union, if you have Moabite blood in you, you're not supposed to be allowed into the congregation of the children of Israel. So then as you work your way through, you get to 1 Samuel 14. There is a list of Saul, the first king of Israel's enemies, and top of the list is the Moabites.
Wow.
So they're like, if you go, hey, Saul, who are your enemies? He'll say, I hate the Moabites. I mean, that's like first one he lists. And if you work on down, it's throughout the biblical story. But here's where it gets interesting. It's almost embarrassing to admit in the Bible, but guess whose ancestry traces to Moab? King David. Think about this.
Right.
Ruth is a Moabitess. So it's really sort of a shock. Like if you go, wait a minute, you mean to tell me that the arch enemy of Israel, the royal dynasty can be traced to a Moabitess? But that's the story we get in Ruth.
It's that little book of Ruth that everyone forgets about.
They do.
And it does say, yeah, what it's through his father's side.
Is his through his maternal line. So Ruth marries into the family. She marries Boaz. You remember the whole story is fascinating. But we have like 7 references in the book of Ruth. As you said, it's a small book, but 7 times it makes it clear that Ruth is a Moabitess. Now, this requires some explanation, Neil, as you can imagine. And why does it require an explanation? Well, because we just learned in Deuteronomy that no descendant of Ruth or no descendant of Moab can be even in the congregation. And now you've got the most celebrated king, David.
City of David, named after him.
Granny, up the line, Granny is from Moab. Now, look, the rabbis and other comments.
He's the anointed king. He's the Moshiach. It calls him.
That's it. He's the top man.
Only his blood can be the Messiah.
Yep. So
this is so important. This is not just one of our kings happened to be half. No. The king.
Well, it's the man, the one who his heart. He's got a heart after God, and so even though he has failings, which the Hebrew Bible records, with Bathsheba and so forth, where he has Uriah killed. Nonetheless, the sweet psalmist of Israel, Neil, David, is Moabite in his descent. Now, there's an interesting story in 1 Samuel 22. By the way, if you can't tell, I love Moab. I love the land and people. Go ahead. Yeah.
Before you get to that, I just want to, this is a really quick passage.
Yep.
Boaz, this is from the Catholic edition. I like these editions because they're I don't know, whatever. It says, Boaz went and took up a seat at the gate. And when he saw a close relative of whom he had spoken come along, he called, come and sit beside me. And he did so. And then Boaz picked out 10 of the elders of the city and asked them to sit nearby. When they had done this, he said to the near relative, Naomi, who has come back from the Moabite plateau, is putting up a sale the piece of the land that belonged to the kinsman Elimelech.
Yep.
I thought I would inform you, bidding you before these here present, including the elders of my people, to put in your claim, for if you wish to acquire it as next of kin, but if you do not wish to claim it, tell me so that I may be guided accordingly, for no one has a prior claim to yours, and mine is next. He answered, I will put my claim. Boaz continued, once you acquire the field from Naomi, you must take also Ruth the Moabite,
That's
the
right.
widow of the late heir, and raise up a family for the departed on his estate.
Yep.
Ooh.
And so you know this, Neil. One thing that's important there, it's really an ancient custom that's being told to the reader in that passage in the book of Ruth. It's called the levirate marriage. So if you die and you haven't birthed a son through your previous marriage, then the brother or the next of kin is required to marry and produce offspring in the name of the father who died before he could have children. So that's what's going on here. He's saying, hey, look, I got this piece of property and I'm offering it, but along with that comes the woman that is the widow of the former owner. And so you're talking about a lot of responsibility that he's saying. If you take it, you got, but see, he's got an ulterior motive. He actually, according to the book of Ruth, he has become infatuated, I guess you could say. I mean, it doesn't say those exact words, but he's watching this girl. She's probably beautiful. She's out working in his fields, and he sees her. He casts eyes on her, and he really wants her, but he's got to do it the right way, Neil. He can't just say, yeah, I got me a girl from Moab. He's got to play the cards right. That's what he's doing in the book of Ruth. So you get and ultimately he wins the game. He gets Ruth, and then through that union, as we read in the short book of Ruth, 4 chapters, he ultimately has Obed is the name of, and then you go on down, and then David. So you're only talking a couple of generations. Now, listen, I know there are people who, because they have what they consider a discrepancy, you can't, no descendant of Moab can be accepted into the congregation of Israel. So they try to really work some theological gymnastics to make it happen. But here's what we really need to admit is that the biblical writers, Neil, this must be authentic because it's embarrassing. In other words, if you really wanted to explain, but they couldn't ignore the fact that it was known that David traced back to Moabite origins. You see my point? So in other words, if it wasn't true, they would just not mention it. But
I was just going to mention that. It's like, so whether people, when we talk about historicity of Old Testament characters, a lot of times when it's past David, when we're going into Moses and Abraham, there's a lot of good reasons to think some of this stuff might not be as historical as it's said in the text. But once we get into this King's era, I think it starts to get more historical. And when we talk about David, there are scholars who think David might not have existed. There are also really good scholars who think he did. And I'm on my personal thought about this is like, when I read a passage like this, my thoughts are, what is the point of making that up, that he's from a Moabite? And then on the other side, I'm the type of person to say, okay, a lot of these legends, like the hitting the giant in the forehead, like this is, and like playing the harp, like looking like King Kinnerus from the Cyprus. A lot of that stuff might be later legends attributed to him, but I think there's still a good argument that he existed historically just as a king.
Yeah.
And what's the reason to doubt that?
Well, you're exactly right. It's like the further back you go, historians, particularly in the minimalist camp, would say, we really just don't have a lot of evidence. Now, by the way, Neil, for your audience, we're going to talk about a proposal of a very essential piece of evidence towards this Davidic kingdom. So what many of the minimalists might say is sort of exactly what you said is, okay, there may be a Davidic king. There may be a David who was the head of what became the famous Davidic dynasty, but it wasn't as powerful as the biblical writers propose. So like if you go to like Finkelstein and some of these guys, they're going to say, Yeah, there's a Davidic kingdom, but it's sort of a Jerusalem's a backwater,
Yeah,
it's a nothing,
they'll say
you
it's
know.
just Jerusalem and maybe 2 other cities connected to it.
Yeah, so
They have
there.
12 tribes. I don't know about all that.
Yeah, so they believe, most minimalist scholars would say, if he existed, he's just sort of a chieftain, like a tribal chieftain, and not some real powerful king who rules the nations as the Bible might propose. But what's so interesting is that, as you mentioned, like a lot of times when scholars get into archaeological excavations and stuff, there seems to be like this barrier. They don't really have a problem dating something, say, to the 9th century BCE. But when you start pushing into that 10th century BCE, people get a little bit nervous, because then you're like, now we're talking time of David, Solomon, and then earlier, even into Saul. It becomes a little bit more tenuous, a little bit more difficult to prove. So people are sort of hands off. But I will tell you this, and we're going to get into this. I really want to talk about some of the evidences of a Davidic house. Again, it still leaves open to debate how powerful that house was, but it sort of gives credence. Like, you look at it and you go, there's probably something there. But the biblical writers are very, very clear that this house of David, that the monarchy is really at war with a lot of its surrounding neighbors, and the chief of which is Moab. Now, 1 Samuel 22, David actually sends his parents to stay in Moab. Again, another piece of embarrassing information, that it must have some trace of historicity, in my view, because otherwise you'd leave it out, right? So he sends his folks to stay in Moab, in his family, like with his maternal family. And I think that's very striking. But then later, when you get to 2 Samuel 8, even David fights against the Moabites. It's really, but I'm just showing this struggle, this sort of a textual tension between Israel and the Moabites. Now, by the time you get to Solomon, Solomon's a ladies' man, right? He's got, according to the text at least, probably exaggerated, but he has 700 wives, 300 concubines. He's a strategic lover. Like, he marries these women in neighboring countries for strategic purposes. Moabites, Ammonites. So, for instance, in 1 Kings 11, it says that he actually, get this, he builds a shrine to what the biblical writers call the abomination of the Moabites in Jerusalem, Neil. He he builds a shrine for one of his old ladies, right? Because he wants to keep her happy, and he's working on this strategic alliance. He builds a temple to Chemosh in Jerusalem. Now, this is the guy, according to the text, who builds the temple to Jehovah 400 and some odd years after the Exodus, if we believe 1 Kings 6:1. But so he's building a temple to Jehovah. Good job, Solomon. Nice. Thank you very much. And he's like, wait till you see the place I built for Chemosh, the god of the Moabites.
Right. And
I mean,
when they describe Solomon's temple, if you read it in the Greek Septuagint, they describe it as, having vines and grapes and satyrs, which is like goat, devil-looking creatures, golden satyrs on these vines. And the other animal they said that was in there was, I think they said eagles, serpents, and then there was centaurs, the horse legs guys. And then you read it in the Hebrew, it sort of says the same thing, but with a different. It says like goat man or
well,
like
it's
horses.
interesting. And see,
So
this
it
this
seems to
this
line up.
is this is your field. I one of the things that I will say is that there's a lot of Phoenician emphasis. Remember, because he's got Hiram, the king of Tyre, is supplying
Who,
the
who,
stuff.
who lived through. He was half of his career under David, and his elderly career with Solomon, according to the text. So
Yep.
he's this Phoenician trader, important ally up in the
Yep.
north. Yeah.
Yes, so you get in the ancient world, you get borrowings from these different regional locations, and so I'm sure that when you look at the temple, you're looking at something that is the greatest architecture of the day, and you couldn't help but get some Phoenician influence in this building. So the point is that Solomon, and he's engaging with these people of Moab, but what begins to happen is after Solomon, in when Solomon dies, the kingdom is divided, and you get the 12 tribes are divided between the house of Israel and the house of Judah. You have Judah is reigned by Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, and Jeroboam the first takes the northern 10 tribes. We often refer to them as the lost tribes of Israel, because ultimately they're carried away by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. But here's the thing. The northern kingdom, Neil, really launches out against the surrounding neighbors. And Finkelstein, some of these other guys really show the power of this northern kingdom as the history of Israel progresses.
When Solomon was old, his wives had turned his hearts to strange gods.
Yeah, baby.
And his heart was not entirely with Yahweh, his God, as the heart of his father David had been, by adoring Astarte, which is Venus, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of Yahweh. He did not follow him undeservedly as his father David had done. Solomon had built a high place to Chemosh, the idol of Moab.
There it is.
And to Molech, the idol of the Ammonites, and on the hill opposite of Jerusalem. He did the same thing for his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrifice to their gods. The Lord, therefore, became angry with Solomon.
As you would imagine, Neil. Hey, by the way, and you and I have been there together. So when it says the hill opposite Jerusalem,
that's the city of David, right?
Well, it's on the Mount of Olives, so it's in prominent view east of Jerusalem. You're talking about, he builds a temple to the Moabite god, the abomination of the Moabites. And so this is like, it's an affront to God. It's an affront to the God of the Hebrews. And that's what the writer is trying to tell us. This isn't just like a minor infraction. This isn't like, some little, a white sin, like a
This is
little
the
bit.
first 3 Ten Commandments completely ignored.
That's exactly right.
That's bad.
Exactly. I mean, that's like if you said, how can I make God as angry as possible? Let me start at the top of the list, Neil, and just work my way down. That's what Solomon did. For someone, again, there's a tension in the text. You have Solomon is the wisest man who ever lived, but he sure didn't act like it sometimes, see?
Yeah.
So this is the image that we get. But what happens, Neil, is once you get the division of the kingdoms, you have a list of kings that goes like this. You have Omri, you have Ahab. Remember, Ahab is the one that's married to Jezebel, who's gone down historically as the rottenest woman of all, Jezebel. And so you've got Ahab, and then when Ahab dies, his son Ahaziah takes over, but it's a short-lived reign. It's only like 2 years, and then Jehoram. So here's what happens, and this is going to bring us into this great biblical discovery. According to the Bible, you have Ahab dies, and then once you get to Ahaziah, this 2-year reign, this from Omri's time particularly, Moab has been subjugated by the northern kingdom, and they're demanding just extreme tribute to be paid. And you study the ancient world, you know all about this tribute being demanded by a powerful ruling nation. So what's happening is Mesha is the king of Moab at the time, and he's watching events. Like he's looking over into Israel and he says, you know, I'm tired of paying this money. And since Omri is dead, Ahab died, Ahaziah seems to be kind of rocked off his heels, taking over the kingdom. You know what would be a good thing for me to do is to quit paying my bills. So he decides, Mesha, according to the biblical text, decides he's not paying. He's not going to pay this fee anymore. So I wanted to look at a couple of texts. If you look at,
I got something real quick that I want to show.
yeah, jump in.
So, Second Chronicles, right? We're talking about King Solomon and his time and all that.
Yeah.
And sure enough, you can look at Second Chronicles 11:15 talks about, for the Levites left their pasture lands and left the possessions, went to Judah and Jerusalem, because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord. And Jeroboam appointed his own priests for the high places of the goat demons. So this is not even just Solomon either. Even later on, and now that's goat demon. That's the Hebrew translation. If you go to the Greek, it's just straight up satyr. Like right
Yeah.
here, I'll show you where it has the word. Let's see, satyr right here. See,
Yeah.
these temple satyrs were very offensive to the Yahweh followers. But like Solomon and Jeroboam, they're still kind of rocking this old way of doing things and sort of, whatever. They're just satyrs. Who cares? Like, I love this stuff because it brings.
Oh,
It
I know
makes me think
it's right up your alley. And
it makes me think it's more historical than people try to give it credit for. Because why would they ever want to admit this?
that's it. And see, that's the thing. You nailed it. What happens is the biblical text, one thing about it that the biblical text doesn't do is no one can pick up the Hebrew Bible. Some people refer to as the Old Testament. No one can pick up the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and read it and get this idea that that the people were absolutely following a pure religion. I mean, it's corrupt from the beginning. And the monarchy is some of the worst stuff in the biblical writings. It talks, over and over. You read just a few moments ago that Solomon didn't follow the ways of God as his father had done. And that becomes a normal refrain, a regular refrain in the writing of Kings and Chronicles, particularly Kings. Chronicles, by the way, does sort of a whitewashing, and it seems to be the more official word from the administration, is the way I tell in my classes, because I'm working through a lot of the monarchy right now. I'm currently wrapping up a series on the world and words of Jeremiah, but Kings is kind of tells it like it is. Some people propose that the original version of Kings, if you could trace it back, was originally records from Jeremiah. And so you get this, but you do get this tension. Now, so what you're pointing out is that it becomes corrupt. The cult, if you will, really gets off the rail, at least in terms of a pure monotheistic, anti-idolatrous type, religion. And it becomes corrupted, and it stays off and on, because you get a few examples of reforms like under Hezekiah, Josiah, where they try to rid the land of all this. But it's got a life of its own. It keeps coming back.
Yeah, and you can find those Asherah trees. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
The Asherah, that's the wife. That's the wife of Yahweh in some of these older texts that predate some of these other.
Yeah, you get one thing is certain and consistent, is that there are quite often traces of just bad religion going bad. I mean, really. Now, so what happens as you go through these kings, you start ticking them off. This guy dies, this guy dies. When you get down to the point where Mesha thinks it's time to make his move, I'm going to read two short texts. 2 Kings chapter 1. This is the way it starts off, Neil. After Ahab's death, Moab rebelled against Israel. And then it gets into this long couple of chapters. And then I want to go down to chapter 3, 2 Kings 3, and we're coming up on the greatest archaeological discovery. So in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 4 and 5 says this. Now, King Mesha of Moab was a sheep breeder. Now, this is the way I would describe my enemy. He's just a sheep farmer, for God's sake. You're telling me the king of a neighboring land is just a sheep breeder. That's what the Hebrew Bible wants you to believe. Okay, here we go. And he used to pay as tribute to the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So here's what I think happened based on what we know. He sees that the kingdom of Israel, Neil, is sort of rocked back on its heels. You know, the king just died. You got a new king in. They're dealing with, local problems. And he's just thinking, I'll get away with it. I'm not going to pay it. Well, he misunderestimated, because after Ahab died, his son Ahaziah takes over. And then next on the list is Jehoram. Jehoram recognizes immediately, he's like, hey, now, by the way, I'm paraphrasing the story in 2 Kings 3. So your viewers can go read the full text of it. But here's what he says. He says, Jehoram says, I'm not going to let him get away with this. Mesha is going to pay me my tribute. So what does he do? He joins up with the king of Judah, who at the time was Jehoshaphat. He tells Jehoshaphat, hey, I want you to join me, and I want you to, let's go get the king of Edom. So you got 3 kings joined together. Judah's king, Israel's king, and the king of Edom, and they plan to swoop around, Neil, and they're gonna conquer Mesha, right? So it tells us the story. So they're preparing, they're going south. If you look at a map, if you picture the Dead Sea and you go south of the Dead Sea from Jerusalem, you go south, go south, go south. Their idea is that they're going to come up from the south on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, and they're going to attack Mesha and force him into subjugation. Now, on their way, they get a little concerned, Neil, and what they're concerned about is they're afraid they're going to die of thirst before they, because you've been to the Dead Sea with me. Yep. That region is pretty dry. So they think they're going to die of thirst before they can complete the troops. They've got massive troops. They've got animals. And so Jehoshaphat decides we've got to involve God in this. You'd think they would have thought about this a little earlier, but they're running low on water. So Jehoshaphat says, call the prophets. Well, guess who they call? Elisha. Everybody knows Elisha. So Elisha does come, but here's what he's got a problem, Neil.
He's kind of a hermit type that's kind of he's a rebellious, anti-establishment kind of guy. Yeah.
And particularly, he's not fond of the kings of the north.
Right.
So Jehoshaphat, he's okay. Jehoshaphat's not so bad. But he's talking, you want me, Elisha, the one who took over after Elijah.
Right.
I'm the mover and shaker of the day. I'm the prophet of God.
He's got the power.
I got the power. We could sing that song. I got the power. So he wants to take over. You want me, Elisha, to be involved with Jehoram, with that guy? So ultimately, Jehoshaphat convinces him to join up and bring God into this adventure. So Elisha tells them, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. The water's not going to be a problem. The wadis, you remember all the dry wadis that run through that region? He says they're going to be filled with water. You're going to be fine. You're going to ultimately go in and conquer Mesha, and you're going to take the land. And it gives them this real positive report. Now, so here's what happens. The next day, I mean, rains come. Sure enough, everything, just like Elisha promised, is starting to happen, Neil. Tick it off, tick it off. Prophet of God gives them a straight report. Meanwhile, the Moabites wake up the next morning and realize they've got the attack coming from the south. So Mesha turns his attention on the Edomites. Now, I'm thinking, Neil, that based on what I know from the time frame and so forth, Edom, let me say it, that Edom is the weaker branch of this this three-pronged attack. But they're not even successful there. When they wake up, one thing that they see, the water that God, according to the text, brought down, said it looked like blood. Now this is pretty cool. I'm going to tell you something that was just in the news. The water looks like blood, and the Moabites think, hey, these three kings must have gotten a battle and filled the land with blood. They died off. And so they kind of let their guard down, and that's what opened up the door for the attack. Now, let me tell you this. We've got to pull this in, Neil. What happened in 2021, in September, I was reading the news, and in the Jerusalem Post, there was an article about the water east of the Dead Sea turned blood red.
It happens. It actually happens in the north in Lebanon. It's called the Adonis River. It's in Babylon. It's in Lebanon, and it's actually a yearly event. Every year during the springtime, when rain starts to come after winter, there's all this red rock that's like it's like oily red rock, and the rain, it builds up during the winter. So then when the rain hits in the spring, it pushes it down into the river. The river turns red every year, and they used to celebrate this as the blood of Adonis in the spring.
I got you.
This happens in nature, but go ahead.
Well, let me tell you this. So even though it's a phenomenon in the north, in the south, it's not so much because remember, of course, the biblical writers, if this were a seasonal thing, they wouldn't record it because anybody reading it would go, yeah, well, that happens every year. Why did that fool Mesha? It rarely happens.
Right.
But what's so interesting about this is that it does actually happen. And when it happens, it happened in 2021. Can you hear that out there? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, it's not that big of a deal. It's fine.
Okay, cool. All right. So September of 2021. Now I'm knee deep in my research for the Moses scroll, and I'm also talking about the Mesha Stele and all. When I read this report in the Jerusalem Post, I was like, oh my God. So I started looking into, is it a regular occurrence? It's not so much in the South. Rarely does it happen. But when it did happen, I said, I bet. Now you look at photographs, Neil, that's what it looks like. It looks like the water it's sort of a dark, deep purple, red, crimson kind of. So that's what happened. It was most likely. And by the way, when this event happened in September of 2021, the local scientific community really got involved, and they said, well, there's a certain algae, there's this, the environment and the situation was just perfect. This happened. So anyway, but it's kind of cool. So anyway, when they see this blood, they think that these kings have killed each other. They let their guard down. The three groups, the Edomites, Israelites, and the people of Judah, attack, and they begin to really kick Mesha's tail. So what does Mesha do? Mesha, in an act of desperation. Now, this is the Hebrew Bible's account, right? The biblical account says that in desperation, he sacrificed his firstborn son on a wall. And once that happened, listen to this. This is, again, the biblical account, chapter 3, 2 Kings 27. Here's what it says. So he took, well, let me back up to 26. Seeing that the battle was going against him, this is Mesha, the king of Moab led an attempt of 700 swordsmen to break a way through to the king of Edom, but they failed. So he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him up on the wall as a burnt offering. a great wrath came upon Israel, so they withdrew from him and went back to their own land. What is that saying? Now, remember, the prophet said you're going to win. But this weird little part of the story seems to be historical, Neil, because it's all of a sudden out of nowhere, it says great wrath came upon Israel and they withdrew. That doesn't sound like a win to me, right? Something else is happening here. But here's the deal. So for 2,700 years, that was the only record of this battle that we had. I mean, that's the story, and we're sticking to it. It's all we knew. But then in August of 1868, a Prussian minister, a missionary, Prussian, right? 1868, the 19th of August. Now, this guy, his name is Frederick Augustus Klein. He's not only a Prussian minister, but he's a missionary and a member of the Church Missionary Society of Jerusalem. He takes a pleasure trip east of the Jordan. Now, I know you know the history, but in the 19th century, Neil, there weren't a lot of Westerners going to. This is like the wild.
The Ottoman territory, right?
That's right. The Ottomans are, but even the Ottomans they hadn't even conquered this land. It was I call it the Wild East. You've heard of the Wild West in the U.S.
Yeah.
But the Wild East was, if you cross that line, Neil, if you cross the rift and you go east into Jordan, you better pay to have guards. You better have somebody hired to help you, because you're going to end up getting kidnapped or harassed or killed even. The Ottomans at this time were trying to subjugate the Bedouin. Look, the Bedouin, I'm looking at a map here. I keep it out all the time. Eveline van der Steen is one of my main sources for life east of the Jordan in the 19th century. And she talks about how the Ottomans under the Pasha, the Wali of Damascus, he's trying to tame this area because he wants it to be civilized. But the Bedouin are like, this is our land. We've lived here from time immemorial. Who are you to tell? The Wali wants to tax them. He wants them to conscript them to military service. He wants them to pay taxes. And they're like, we're living in tents, brother. This is our land. Get out of here. So they're always at war.
Well, if you look at like this is perfect right here that I have this.
All right.
If you look at some of these maps of like the geopolitical situation of the time, Prussia is sort of more on the side of the Ottomans than they are with the Russians. So they're surrounded by enemies, but they ally with these Muslims for the sake of, there are Christian nations in this time period that are aligned with the Ottomans.
Yep,
that became a thing because you want power. It's not about ideology anymore. You want power at this time. You know what I mean?
And the Ottomans control this whole area, right? So now at the same time, there's a lot going on in the world at the time, but the Ottomans are ruling this area, but they have yet to really subjugate this land east of the Jordan. So this is the environment. So you just didn't. I mean, there were a few families of Bedouin, a few Arab families that you could hire. In fact, one is the Arakat family, and you know from reading my book that this guy, the Sheikh of Abu Dis, Arakat, he's one of the guys that you could hire to bring you safely if you wanted to go. But look, there weren't many Westerners that made this trek. You just didn't do it. Frederick Augustus Klein is on sort of a pleasure trip east of the Jordan. He's hired one of these guards, someone who could protect him. And this particular guard is a man by the name of Zatam. He's son of Thindi al-Faiz, who happens to be the son of the sheikh of a major tribe of Bedouins. So you go with Zatam, he's got the connections. Like if someone was going to mess with you, you could say, look, I'm just telling you, I'm with Zatam, his dad, Findi al-Faiz. And then they would say, oh, okay, so he's there. And on August the 19th, they arrive at a Bedouin camp. And as they settle in, he's told by Zatam, Frederick Augustus Klein is told by Zatam, hey, I've got something I want to show you. It's a treasure. It's the wonder of the region, Neil. No Frank, that's what they called all Westerners. No Frank has ever laid eyes on this. And Klein says, what is it? He goes, well, it's this inscribed stone made of basalt. We don't know what it says. It's written in ancient characters, but no one else has ever seen this other than, the locals. So he goes, okay, where's it at? He said, it's at a place, right, Dibon. Now, Dibon is an ancient site. So this is 1868. It's a tell. Wow. A tell is, as your viewers may or may not know, it's a built up area because it's sand has accumulated.
Actually, I have a good image of one right here. I happen to have it loaded up. It's this. This is like a tell right here, right?
There you go. Yeah. And so you can see the different levels. And so, but on the surface, this Zatam tells him on the surface, this stone is lying there. So he goes to look at it. When he gets there, it's sort of toward the evening, and sure enough, it's a black basalt. It's rounded. Now get this, Neil. This is something you need to know. It's rounded on the top and the bottom. It's about 3 foot 10 inches tall, little over. It's about 2 feet wide and about 14.5 inches thick. Rounded on top and bottom. It's got 34 lines of text. He doesn't know what language it's in, but he draws a chart of it. This chart, which we'll show, this is the chart that he actually drew. He sketched this. Now, I have this photograph because I went to the Palestine Exploration Fund, and the director there at the PEF is Felicity Cobbing, and Felicity Cobbing allowed me to take a photograph of this sketch. So I don't know if it's been shown, on a video like we're doing now. I mean, this is a gorgeous, you'll see that? So this is the reason it's important to show this, is because if anyone thinks they know something about the Moabite stone, what does it look like on the bottom every time you see it? It's squared off.
So that's when it was found?
That's it. Yeah, this is August 19th, 1868. This is the sketch.
Now, what did they?
Well, yeah,
okay,
go ahead.
Continue. I'll ask my question.
So now, Frederick Klein, he sees it in the evening, but he's got to go back to Jerusalem the next day. So he quickly remember, he doesn't know the language, Neil. So he just he draws, he looks at the thing before him, and he replicates as best he can in his sketchbook what some of these characters look like. And then he counted the lines. Thank goodness. He measured the thing. He counted he said there are 34 lines. They're about 1.25 inches apiece. He did have 4 or 5 people with him, Arabs. So he asked them to flip this so that they could look at the backside and see if there was any writing. There wasn't. It was smooth on the back. The only writing was on the top. He did mention that the first 3 or 4 lines were a little bit damaged from weather, but he said otherwise it was perfect. It's perfect in situ. This is where it was found, right? So he returns to Jerusalem the next day, and when he gets back to Jerusalem, he goes to the Prussian consul, a man by the name of Peterman. Herr Peterman is the Prussian consul, and he tells him, man, look, this is what I found in across there. You have to see this. I made this sketch. What alphabet is this? Now, Peterman happens to be a scholar. He's into archaeology, and and knows quite a bit. So he looks at this thing and he immediately recognizes that it's Phoenician characters.
Oh,
right?
wow.
So he begins to look at, and he can tell he needs to spend more, he needs to see this thing up close.
For anyone who wants to know what Phoenician characters looks like,
Oh, yeah.
a good way to think about this is the way you compare Latin and English. They use the same alphabet, but they have different words and they speak different language. But the alphabet is almost identical, if not is identical. So Phoenician would have been the alphabet that the Hebrews would have used to write their language in, even though the language is different.
Yeah, and one thing that's cool about that is, this particular drawing shows some of that, and almost any chart, like I know you've studied ancient languages, and so almost any chart shows that these Phoenician characters, these letter forms, are sort of the basis, like you said, for a lot of alphabets that came later. Now, the other thing that's interesting is, so when he goes to Peterman recognizes immediately, oh man, you're telling me there are 34 lines of text, and he said, yeah, and every so often, I suppose, in between words, there are word dividers, so like dots in the on the inscription itself. So he gets all excited, and ultimately what happens is Peterman writes immediately to the Prussian government, and he said, I need some money. We need to buy this. Now, here's the other dynamic going on in the Holy Land, Neil. You've got people are beginning to, transportation means are getting better. There are people coming from the U.S. on steamships. Europeans are coming to the Holy Land with as we say, the Bible in one hand, a spade in the other. And they're looking for and trying to uncover archaeological proof of the Bible. Wow. So the Prussians see this as an opportunity to kind of take a jump up. Think about it, man. If you could acquire this ancient relic, and it turns out to be something like it actually did, and you could get it for your museum in Berlin, you're leading the world.
Yeah.
You all of a sudden you're up here where England and all these others are down here. So he makes a really big effort. So and by the way, the story in all detail is in my book. It's a fascinating story. So there's this a race to try to acquire it. But here's what I find interesting. Initially, Neil, the other nations were very gentlemanlike. Like the English with Charles Warren, everybody knows Warren. You've got Warren, you've got Dr. Barclay. The English in particular are saying, as much as we'd like to take these rumors we're hearing in the streets and move forward and try to acquire this for ourselves, we're going to stay back and let the Prussians, they're the ones, they're working the deal. So for a while that goes on, but it drags on and on. And I won't go into all the details, but put it this way. A year into this, Neil, the Prussians still hadn't acquired it. And what's happened is now you've got different tribes of Bedouin. Guess what they now know? These Franks recognize that this is valuable. There can be some money made out of this. Well, the Prussians are getting frustrated. So they decide that they're going to get the Wali of Damascus, the Ottoman ruler, to issue a firman putting his foot down, because the Westerners think that the Ottoman rulership has the Bedouin subjugated, but they don't. So the Wali says, hey, you guys, Bedouin, y'all better give those people the thing that they're trying to get. And you know what I'm not going to say it because they probably said a bad word, but they decided we're not going to get, in fact, not only are we not going to give this thing up, guess what they did? They build a fire. This is the true story, man. They build a fire and they put on top of the coals the Moabite stone. And they heat it until it's glowing, and simultaneously they cast rocks on it and they throw water on it, and the combination of the rocks and the cold water shattered the Moabite stone into pieces and pieces. Now, so how do we know what it says? The only reason we know is because in the interim between the Bedouin getting mad and breaking it, a few other people had one guy by the name of Clermont Ganneau. About a year into this, he's tired of waiting on the Prussians, so he hires an intermediary. He hires an Arab by the name of Yaakov Karavaka, and they send a delegation with squeeze paper. You know what squeeze, where you take, sort of like paper mache. You take this heavy paper and you wet it and you put it on a lapidary, an inscription. You push it, like push, so that the material goes into the inscription. And when it dries, Neil, then you peel it off and you've got a reverse of that inscription. So before the Bedouin destroyed it, Yaakov Karavaka is he makes a squeeze, but while he's making the squeeze, it's not quite dry. That word gets out. You got somebody down there right now at the stone. So different Bedouin tribes show up and a fight erupts. Wow. And Karavaka actually gets stabbed in the leg with a spear, but he's able to pull. Now it rips into 7 pieces, the squeeze paper. But he gets on a horse and he makes it out with his life and a damaged, not so great squeeze. So he gets back to Jerusalem. He hands this over to the Frenchman named Monsieur Charles Clermont Ganneau. He's the bad guy in my book, if you remember. Clermont Ganneau is really the one, because of this fight. They suggest, some of the contemporary writers suggest, that this is what led to the Bedouins' last straw. They said, that's it. I mean, nobody can have it. So they blew it up. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, the race is still on. They're trying to get all the pieces. And ultimately, between the bad squeeze, 2 big chunks. Let's pull up a photograph here, Neil, of what people, there it is. That's what we most often see when you look at the Moabite stone. You see how it's got the different shapes, and it looks like a Frankenstein kind of deal. It's got pieces that are put together. You see the 2 big pieces on the screen? Those 2 major pieces are actually authentic. And you see there are a few others in that? Yep. Now, the rest of that is made by Clermont Ganneau. A lot of people don't know this. And see how it's square on the bottom? See, that's the reconstruction later. So ultimately what happens is the Prussians are really messed over. Clermont Ganneau swoops in. He's got more money. He gets the backing, and he is not really a gentleman in this case. In fact, this is a book. I'll just hold it up. You ever get a really good bargain online?
Oh,
look
wow.
This is 1871. I've got a plastic wrapper on it because it's fallen apart. This is Dr. Ginsburg's edition of the Moabite Stone. I was looking for a copy of the book and I thought I'd just get a reprint. And I found for $8 on eBay, and it said 1871. I ordered it, Neil, when this came in, and I realized it was an original. Anyway, so I read this. I look at it just like it's, But in this book,
sold it online for $8.
$8, brother. Sometimes you can get a bargain. And in this text, by the way, I put all this in my book, The Moses Scroll, but he says some pretty ugly things about Ganneau. He talks about how he was a savant, but he was much more. He had much more. I forget the way he put it. Something like much more initiative than sense. He ultimately caused it to be destroyed. So what we've got though is that it was reconstructed. And by 1870, this is real quick work. I got to give it to Gano. By January of 1870, he's already published the transcript, meaning he's looking at the items that he has. The squeeze, there was a transcription that Salim al-Qari made of 7 lines, and he's basically published. He was the first one out the gate to publish a transcription and a translation of it. So I know your audience is like, okay, what does it say?
Right.
All right. So the Mesha Stele, as this basalt object came to be known, tells a story. It is a stela, it's a celebratory monument by Mesha, the king of Moab. It dates, get this, it dates to the 9th century BCE. It's written in Phoenician characters. Again, 34 lines of text. And it basically tells the same story, Neil, as we read in 2 Kings 3. This is what makes it so remarkable. Because, first of all, let me just say, there are not many occurrences in antiquity outside of the Bible which mention the people of Israel. The ones that we know of are few and debated, right? I know you've probably covered some of these on your shows with other
I
guests.
was just talking about this yesterday, and we were saying that, or 2 days ago, the stela, the Egyptian, which is the one that supposedly mentions Israel before this one, which is in the 12th, 13th century.
The Merneptah.
That one, I agree with the skeptic scholars. There's a lot of them. I looked it up. There's 4 of them I mentioned the other day, and I found there's like 10 more. They think it's Jezreel because it'd be the same exact phonetically. It'd be the same exact thing. And the reason why they think that is because this pharaoh is mentioning cities, and he's not mentioning nations. He's mentioning cities, and then all of a sudden he mentions Israel, and then he mentions more cities. So it's like, in the region that all these cities are in, we know Jezreel existed in that time. So it's like probably Jezreel. This might be the first time, this Mesha Stele might be the first time Israel is mentioned in any text.
It very well could. And to your point, Neil, you know, in the book of Hosea in the Hebrew Bible, which is directed to the northern kingdom, Jezreel, as we say it in English, the anglicized version, it's sort of a word play of that northern kingdom, which most of the minimalist scholars would say, no, we think that there is an Israel, but it's the northern kingdom, and they're the dominant force. The kingdom of Judah is this backwater or whatever. So, you know, it could be. But your example is one of the examples I'm talking about, where a lot of scholars would say, look, I know the fundamentalist, the apologist really wants to find evidence of the biblical text in archaeology, etc. They're debated and they're few. But let me tell you about, as far as the Moabite Stele, the Mesha Stele, the Moabite Stone, it is, let's say this, it is the most accepted. Now, it doesn't mean that some don't think it's authentic. I mean, there have been arguments all along from the discovery point which suggested that it was a forgery. There are recent suggestions by scholars you can find now. But when
the date of it makes it believable, because there's no reason not to think Israel was already in existence.
That's right. That's right. And again, it's the kings that are mentioned in this are northern kings. Omri, as we say in English, you know, it's Israel, it's north, and that's the big enemy. So what's so fascinating about this is not only is the Moabite Stele the most accepted, and here's where that happened. 1945, the dean of archaeology, right? if you talk about who is the man in 1945, it's W.F. Albright. Albright is still, considered one of the greatest of all time. Once Albright put his stamp of approval and said that is authentic, case closed, baby. Now, people who argue it today that it might not be, they have to argue against Albright and some of these others. But so in the Stela, this is not just a few lines. We're talking 34 lines, and it basically tells the same story as 2 Kings chapter 3. Not only does it tell the very similar story, but the name Jehovah actually appears on this stela in line 18. So if people want to go find line 18, we can show them the ancient name of the Hebrew God, not an abbreviated form. A lot of people, sometimes in antiquity, we find, the three-lettered name of God, Yod He Vav. But if you look at line 18, you'll see Yod He Vav He in Paleo characters. So this particular text is really interesting. Not only does it have God's name, but it also has 14 other place names that we know from the biblical account. There you go. Yep. And
I don't know why they lengthen it like that. Why don't they just put Yod He Vav He here? But whatever.
Well, yeah, a lot of the translations that we see today go back to the 19th century, particularly in German schools.
That's why you get that Jehovah.
Yeah, and it's fairly common in academic European German sources to use Jehovah. But and it goes, think about Wellhausen and the if you talk about the documentary hypothesis, the J version of the Pentateuch is the Jehovistic, because of the J. Okay, so anyway, all of these correlations suggest that this is what happened. Now, let me just say this. We're going to we ought to show the actual, I know you just popped it up on the screen, but people can read the story and see 18 correlations between the Mesha Stele and the biblical account in 2 Kings chapter 3.
Oh, by the way, there's your Yod He Vav He in Phoenician right there.
Yeah, there it is. There it is. Yep.
See, now, I know my Phoenician. I know it.
I know you do. I've been in the Siloam tunnel with you and watched you read the text. So this is a fascinating text. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So if you look at coming out of the 19th century, transcriptions were published. There were like 7 major ones. Ganot, Ginsburg, Schlotman in Germany. A lot of these kind of hit the press. It's the greatest archaeological discovery of the day, so it's going to make the news. Well, here's what happens. So let me bring us into the 20th century. Like this isn't over. So in 1994, Neil, a brilliant scholar by the name of Lemaire, Andre Lemaire, he's an epigrapher. He's the man. If you ask anybody, this guy knows his stuff. He's one of the top guys in his field. He proposed that line 31 of the Mesha Stele actually had the Hebrew Beit David, the house of David. Now, he reconstructed this because if you spell out Beit David in Hebrew, it's the letter Beit, Tav, Dalit, Vav, Tav, right?
And sometimes you see that in the Arabic, it'll be Daoud.
Yeah, Daoud. Yeah.
They use that vowel for the Vav, which is interesting. Because
So what? But this you can't. It's like people that countered the argument said, "Okay, I see your Beit, and I see the Vav and the Dalit, but I don't see those 2 center letters." So that was in 1994. But a lot of people did support his reading and said, I see where you're coming. Maybe this does talk about the house of David. Now, if that's the case, it enters into a field of other controversies, like the discovery at Tel Dan in the north, which some have proposed also mention the house of David, which goes to our point earlier is the Davidic dynasty mentioned or is it not in antiquity? Well, these are two debated readings, this being one of them. Okay, so that's in
What's the other
1994.
translation that they think that it is, other than David? Do they say that or no?
Here they don't. They just show that there's a gap, and they just show the Hebrew transcription. And as far as I know, they don't even bother to give a translation here. In fact, I was looking earlier before our call just to see if I could see what's the latest, greatest. So
Right.
it's not like people are, in my view, at least as far as I know, they're not saying, no, it doesn't say that, it says this. They're just saying, oh, we don't know what it says there. We don't have enough
But
letters to make
that's
a.
interesting. That means like if they're going to refute that it's David, you better have at least a better option.
Well,
Other than that, what is it then?
well, I'll tell you, it's a fun debate, and I can go through this pretty quickly. So 94. Now in 2022, Lemaire comes back again with a scholar he co-writes with named Jean-Philippe Delorme. And these two scholars have new photographs. So in Barr, in the winter 2022 edition, they come out with these new photographs and they say, now look. And their proposal is the same, Neil. They say, look at here. We said it said the house of David, and here's better photographs which prove our point. And so a lot of the world said, wow, okay. I'm seeing, I give you, it does look a little bit closer. But just recently, this is why I wanted, when you asked me what we wanted to talk about, I said, let's hammer this home because this is late breaking, Neil. This isn't, I know we've been talking about the 19th century, but this is now they're debating this.
Yeah.
It's like, stay tuned. The jury's still out. So here you go. Spring of 2023 edition of Barr magazine. This is hot off the press. There's an article called Set in Stone, ? Another look at the Mesha Stele by two scholars, one of which I actually know and I have the greatest respect for. His name is Matthew Rochelle, and he and Andrew Burlingame wrote this article, and they counter. They say it doesn't say Beit David. All right. Now, if you haven't read this article, in fact, before we talked about making a show on this, the main reason I wanted to get in touch with you the other day is because I know you love the Paleo-Hebrew. And I was going to say, check this article out, because here's what he says. This is written in such a way that anyone who even doesn't know Paleo could get into the argument, because he says it really involves, and do you know how to look for the letter X? Can you find a triangle? How about a dot?
The dalet is the triangle, and then
Yeah.
I know the whole alphabet in Phoenician.
But I'm saying for your viewers who don't, if I said, do you know what an X looks like in English? And they could say, yeah. Do you know what a triangle looks like? Yeah. Do you know what a dot looks like? Then you can do this game too.
Yeah, I could show them the alphabet, and then they can decode it themselves.
That's what he does in this article. It's very well done. And he says, if you can pick those three images out, you can play along with me. And what they do is they work through it and they basically just say, I'm sorry, I don't see it. But if I can, let me read their final conclusion and show you why it's still up in the air. Listen to this.
Sure.
In conclusion, this is Burlingame and Rochelle. In conclusion, we find no solid evidence for the X, the Tav, the triangle, the Dalet, or the dot, the word divider. Accordingly, while the reading Beit David is not impossible, did you hear that? Not impossible.
Right.
It remains purely hypothetical. We may well be wrong, of course. But while we are sorry not to agree with Lemaire and Delorme's fascinating proposal, we prefer to err on the side of caution.
Right.
So they're saying, Neil, maybe those guys are right. We don't see it. It's an excellent article, and I think it's fun for people to get into this field and actually entertain the question of, could it be? Whether it supports a reading of the House of David, though, Neil, in my view, this is one of the most fascinating discoveries of all time. Again, I go through a lot. I read dozens of contemporary reports from the 19th century when it was discovered to retell the story in my book, The Moses Scroll, because it is, to this day, like one of the greatest correspondences to the biblical text. But it's fun to get into this. Now, here's one other thing that I'd like to say. Klein, a year or so after Gano had published his transcription and all, with the square bottom and redone it, Klein is beside himself because he's the only Westerner who ever saw it before it was blown up by the Bedouin. And he published an article in March of 1870, the 23rd of March, 1870, and he set the record straight. He says Gano is confused. He never saw it. He said it should be rounded on both ends, and he kind of set the point straight, having seen it. And the other thing he said, and this is where I'll wrap up what I have to say about this. He said, most assuredly, a scientific expedition to Moab is a great desideratum and could not but greatly enrich our knowledge of Hebrew archaeology. So the reason, Neil, that I'm in love with the land of Moab, the reason that I'm going there every chance I get, I'm going in caves, I'm looking, because it's been forsaken. It has been left out of the equation. So many people go on a Holy Land tour. They want to go to Israel. I do too, but they don't walk through the border to the land of Moab. If you think about it, Neil, how much of the Bible is traced to that land? I don't know. The greatest monarchy of all time, the House of David, traces its origin there. If you're a king in David's line, the blood of Moab runs through your veins. You got to check out the poem on my website that I wrote. It's set to music. You got to check it out. But the blood of Moab runs through every Hebrew monarch's vein. Moab, the land where Moses died and was buried. Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating story, and I'm still doing research there, and I'm currently working on another book about Moab. There's the Tel Dan inscription. I see.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting. So you have this, the letters look like, the bet, tav,
Yep.
dalet, and then you got the vowel of vav, and then dalet again. So yeah, it looks like House of David, which would look like House of Daudo, like we said in the Arabic. Said that's what it looks like in Arabic, or whatever. Just looking at the words, just like transliterating it. That's what you would do. Which
now, let me leave that up, Neil, because highlight the BTDWD on there again. So notice I know you know this, but for the viewers, anything in brackets, what the author or the proposer of a reading is suggesting is whatever is in brackets is not visible to the eye. It's proposed. In other words, the person looking at it says, I think I see this particular letter. In that case, the first letter of David.
Yeah. And so all the skeptics out there who are like, come on, I'll give you something for your side. Israel Finkelstein, legend, by the way. I think he's a great scholar. He came along and he shut this party. Well, I wouldn't say shut the party down, but he threw up a 3-pointer for the other team, and it says that he thinks this says Balak. He thinks it's a bet, not a dalet.
Yeah.
So that changes some stuff. But so we have, it's possible both ways, I think.
Yeah,
I don't think Israel Finkelstein, who I respect greatly, I don't think he has the last word on this.
no, I think he certainly is one of those that has a word for
Right.
sure. But the reason that I so love academic discourse is that you really do entertain the different options here. You have people, one side will come forward and bring forward an argument, and the other side argues the other way. I mean, that's
But
what you do.
but you know what's interesting about Balak? Even if it was Balak, that's still a biblical character.
Yeah.
We're still talking about a character who's the king of the Moabs, who is the one that Balaam goes and speaks to.
Yep.
So
Now,
that's interesting. That's a whole nother interesting story right there to unfold. Even if
it
that was
really is. It really is. And when you talk about, you look at like stories like Balak, you look at that, you find that in the book of Numbers. This Tel Dan inscription would be later, but here's the key. So some academics believe that later writers would take events and personalities of their time and put them back in time. All right. So what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. Again, in Moab, at a place called Der Allah, there were inscriptions found on the wall of a building dating back early. I'm talking at least Iron Age, and in red letters. By the way, I always, when I taught on this before, I talk about the red lettered edition. On the wall at Der Allah, there's mention of a Balaam, a prophet who sees visions from God. Well, we know a Balaam from the book of Numbers, chapter 22 through 24. Well, it's very similarly, if Finkelstein is right about the reading of the Tel Dan inscription, there you have Balak dating probably to, maybe the same time as the inscriptions at the Allah. And, so you have these figures from
right.
east of the
It's
Jordan
still it's still
finding their
it's
way.
still a biblical story being validated, even if it's not.
Yeah.
And the very least here, let's say Finkelstein's 100% correct. You still have a Yahweh inscription there. You still have that. You still have Israel, Israel. So you still have the northern kingdom being mentioned, people that worship Yahweh, and then you still have another biblical king, Balak, being mentioned. So
Yeah.
even Finkelstein coming through as a skeptic, as a rationalist, as a critical analyst of this stuff, even he's like, yeah, here we go. The Bible's starting to be mentioned in the 9th century.
This is what I love. I know you and I, we've spent time together in the promised land, in the Holy Land. And the thing that really thrills me, what I love to do, because I'm not a fundamentalist, as you know, but at the same time, give the book credit where credit is due.
I agree.
So if you go, look, I have friends that are skeptical as all get out, and they say, "Oh, you're a nut." And I say, "Well, okay, well, explain this riddle me this. You tell me how an archaeological discovery dated to the 9th century by the majority of scholars, you tell me how it tells a story very similar to the Hebrew Bible's 2 Kings chapter 3. It's got the same characters. Oh, by the way, remember when we read the text in 2 Kings 3 where Israel's kicking their tail, they're kicking their tail, and then it says great wrath came on Israel and they went home? It sounds to me like they got beat. Well, the Mesha Stele doesn't mention that he killed his own son on a wall, but it says we beat Israel back and sent them home. I mean, what are the chances, Neil? I mean, these two accounts are very, very close, and I just think it's remarkable. It is, again.
I think if you're a skeptic and you have, for whatever reason, maybe you had a bad experience at a bad church, and you just want you're in opposition for good reasons. Maybe people have their reasons for things. I think the best way to approach this is to at least have the have that open mind to there is probably a historical layer to these texts. They're not just all completely made up from a bunch of liars that are trying to control everybody. Like let's not jump to that conclusion. And the reason why, and you get people who have that.
Oh yeah.
It's all made up by a bunch of liars, murderers, and rapists, and the worst people in the world. It's like, no, these are regular human beings who have beliefs and who have traditions, and they're passing down these sacred myths, and there's historical kernel truths to these stories.
Hey,
You know,
yeah, Neil. I mean, we've talked about that. I think the way I approach it is I want to test the text with every way that I can. So I want to look at the linguistic characteristics. I want to look at the land, the language, and the literature. So when I go, like if it says, if a biblical account records a war that took place between this people and this people, I want to say, well, did those people exist at that time? If they didn't, it's embellished. But if they did, then what do we know? Can we validate or disprove a story based on what we know historically? And
right.
that's what a person can have bad experiences with religion or with biblical faith, and I get that, but that doesn't make them someone who has to drop their integrity at the door. I would say give it a chance. If it tests out, I mean, think about it. I tell people, look at 2 Kings 3 and the Mesha Stele. You know what I think? The truth lies somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
I mean, you got two different accounts. Again, I go back to the way we started. If two people fight, you're going to tell the story to your benefit. I scuffed him up. I won. I beat him, whatever. And the other person's going to say, well, I got the best of him. You're like, my goodness, man, you look
It's a
pretty
great example of that. The Hittites and the Egyptians that went to war in the plain valley of what is it? Armageddon.
Yep.
And we have records from both sides saying
Yep.
the Hittites are like, we won. We
Yep.
crushed them. And then the Egyptians were like, well, we didn't crush them, but we did okay. We didn't lose. So
Yeah.
they're like, all right, I think the Hittites might have had the edge here because they're both, but like, I don't know if it was a major win for the Hittites because after this war was over, it seems to be that Egypt was still controlling that land.
Yeah.
So it's like, and then you're piecing together all the evidence, and you're like, all right, here's where the truth is. It lies kind of in the middle.
Yeah. And again, if some of your viewers are very fundamentalist in your view, that's fine. But what you can take away from this is something for everyone, basically, because a fundamentalist person who really believes the biblical text, guess what? We gave you in this discussion a piece of archaeological evidence unlike anything else. Anything, arguably, this is the most important discovery for validating a biblical text in that sense. And if someone says, well, I'm kind of skeptical, well, I would challenge you to say, are you telling me that nothing in the biblical text reflects historicity? Come on, man, that's not fair.
That's a little extreme. I agree.
You have to, I think that, and you have a wonderful audience. Your audience is some that can balance between what they know from history versus, and that's what I try to bring out in my weekly classes and my podcast and my books. I want to bring a balanced view to the table. I mean, look, it doesn't do me any good I don't have a dog in the hunt, as we say, about presenting something false. I'm fascinated with the historical truth, that I want to find what is the truth. And people might say, oh, well, that's kind of, what does that really mean? Well, I mean, what can we validate from archaeological surveys and so forth? It's what drives me is I want to find that element of validity in some of these histories. So
absolutely, I love it. And yeah,
hey, we have to go back, man. We need to go to Egypt together. You can show me around.
Let's
We'll
talk.
go to
Let's get,
Jordan. I'll show you around.
Derek was talking about how he wants to set up a trip to get my audience that wants to pay and come along with us, yours and Derek's. We can get a whole bus.
Yep, we're
And we
talking.
could do package deals, and we could try to figure out if we can get like 22 people on this bus. It'll cost a certain amount of money, and we can all have a lifetime of our lifetime.
Oh man, I'm telling you,
I
and
really, I'll never forget that trip. It was amazing.
it really was, and we're gonna do it again. I don't know exactly when we'll pull it together, but when we do, the two of us are gonna be there.
Yeah.
And imagine, I'm sure that some
And
of your audience.
Egypt too. We got to do Egypt too. That
Oh yeah, no doubt, no
beautiful
doubt.
Saqqara. I'm not going to tell. I can't say how. I can't even express in words how beautiful Saqqara was. Amazing. The
Hey,
stuff I
look,
saw in there. I went down into this tunnel for like a mile. I'm like, where are we go? We're underground. Like, what is going? Huge opening up down there, and then like there's giant bricks, and I'm like, whoa, this is more like 2500 BCE. Are you kidding me?
hey, were you when you went? Did you take? Because I'm going this fall to knock tours. We're bringing a group to Egypt, Jordan, Israel, like I mentioned, but we're doing a 3-day, 3-night Nile cruise where you go down the Nile and you stop. Did you guys do that, or did you do it a different way?
They the people that I went there for 3 days with
Yeah, I
somebody.
know you had
Person I
filming projects.
person I went there with jumped on that exactly what you said. They went on to
Okay,
the
okay,
Nile boat. I was gone after that. I once, I
yeah,
was I was just kind of jumping around, like doing my own thing and
that's cool. Yeah, yeah.
hatching along with people that were doing, it was fun. I was by myself for a whole day actually with just a guide, an Arabic guide, and
Yeah.
me and him went to Saqqara alone, and that was the best day probably.
I tell you what, man,
Most
it's
people probably
amazing.
would have said, "Don't do that. That's probably a bad idea. Don't go alone." I did it. I just did. I just was like, "Fuck it, let's."
Hey, no, I think,
And I don't regret it. It was amazing.
I encourage people to travel. A lot of people are fearful about travel, but
No,
people, I love people. People in the
me
world
too.
are people. I have friends that are Christians, Jews,
Those are
Muslims.
good people over there for sure.
Absolutely. And in fact, on one of a recent tour, I'll just say quickly, someone left a bag and they were very concerned. They'd never traveled before. And they said, I don't know, was that area a good area? I said, listen, this area is full of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, all of which who claim to believe in God and believe that stealing is wrong. If
Right.
you're going to lose your bag, this is the one place you ought to be good. And sure enough, we went back and someone had taken it to the desk. And so I think that's
And
the
that's such a good point. Is like we have some customs here that are very progressive and good. And we treat people equally, and and
yeah,
it might not be exactly like that over there, but they do have customs that we don't necessarily follow.
that's
Like
true.
you mentioned, you might drop something on the ground, someone's going to hand it to you.
That's right.
Like you don't have gangs and criminals and murders happening over there. It's not like that. It's very surprising to see. It's a different world, but like they have their strengths too that we
That's
don't
right.
have, you know.
Well, one thing we have to do just one more time before we have to go is we have to go to the land of Moab. Oh, and one other thing, if you ever decide to have me back, there's another thing that ends up, according to an ancient text, ends up in the land of Moab. You ready?
Yeah,
The Ark of the Covenant, according to at least one tradition, the tent, the scroll, that's what my book's about, is discovering a scroll that Moses
and
wrote in the land of
that's
Moab.
another thing. The Ark of the Covenant, everyone wants to say it's fake, it's not real, it's mythology. But then what is it based? It's got to be based on something.
Let me tell you, let me leave your viewers with this. Think about this. I learned this from our friend Dr. Tabor, by the way, years ago. Have you ever heard of the other Ark of the Covenant, Neil?
Is it the
Now,
one that's
look,
mentioned in Maccabees?
listen. Now, well,
Because
okay, so
in Maccabees, they're like, we still have it. In
yeah.
fact, not only do we still have it, we're going to go bury it in Mount Sinai, and that's going to be the end of
Well,
it.
here's the story. This is the thing that we leave them with, is this. According to the Pentateuch, not Deuteronomy, but the other books, if you look at Exodus and the book of not so much Leviticus is mentioned, but mainly in Exodus, we have the story of two artisans by the name of Betzalel and Aholiab, and they make the ark that everyone sees in the movies. Got beautiful cherubim, cherubim on the top, and so forth. Okay, that's one ark. And it's made by Bezalel and Aholiab. Well, Deuteronomy doesn't know about that ark, Neil. In Deuteronomy, it mentions a different ark, the ark that Moses made. And it's a simple box. Moses makes it, not Bezalel and Aholiab. And in that account, I think that is a different ark. And it's something maybe we could do another show whenever you're listening. I mean, your viewers may watch and say, yeah, let's talk about that. We could talk about the Ark of the Covenant and go into all the different legends. Where did it go?
Let's set this up for whenever, next week if you want. I don't care.
Well, yeah, maybe as soon as we can, if people want
whenever you want to come back, and because I think that would be a fun topic. Let's get critical and let's give it a fair shake. Let's do both.
Sure. Yeah.
I love it. That's what I'm trying to bring here in this channel. Trying to bring let's give this stuff a fair shake, but let's also have that critical analytical mind too.
That's right. Be fair, man. Be fair. Have integrity. If
I noticed there are a lot of people who it almost seems like they jump into it like this, arguing for one side.
Yeah.
Why? What? Who cares? Like, why even have any have any dog in the fight? Let's see where the data lands. Let's just find it just seems like you get a lot of people on both sides, atheists or theists, and they're already trying to put the pieces together in the way they want it to be, to make an argument, to make it sound like they're already doing that before even they have their hypothesis, and that becomes an axiom, and then the truth has to wiggle on that axiom somehow.
Yeah, people want to declare this is the truth and make every data point match their truth.
Right.
The unique thing that you're doing with your audience and what I'm trying to do on my channel is I'm trying to say, here's what the evidence suggests. Let's look at this. Let's go to these places. Right now, as we do this interview, my son is working on some things for an upcoming series that's going to come out in June. I'll be sure and let you know, but it's going to be another biblical figure, and we're not going to tell who yet, but it's going to be this kind of thing. What do we know from archaeology? What do we know from the text? And that's what I think you have to do. You're doing it every week. Let the evidence speak. Let the sand tell us the truth.
I love it.
You got to go back to the dirt, man. You can't.
The sand tell us the truth. I love that. I got to use that.
That's it. Hey, man, look, until we meet again, maybe next time we will do the ark or whatever. Tell people in the comments, they can tell us what they want us to hear us talk about. Look, if it's in between these covers,
let's do it.
I'm game, baby.
All right. Well, once again, the links are in the description, rossknichols.com. You can get the Moses Scroll there, which is an amazing book. And you have a YouTube channel showing that on the screen right now. That's for free. You don't got to pay for that one. And you're going to get all the good content there. I watch this channel all the time. I'm always watching your videos and your lives. Tabor's on there a lot. Derek's on there, me. So check that channel out. Subscribe, hit the bell. And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.